I think we are ready.
So good morning and welcome to the final 6th day of CIJ Summer Conference. This morning we have something very special for you and all the way from Canberra, Annika Smethurt, who writes for the Herald Sun and the Sunday Telegraph in Australia. And as many of you will know, on the 4th of June 2019, Australian Federal Police raided Annika's home and seized material over her story that she wrote the previous year about Australian government plans for greater surveillance of the Australian people. The raid appears to have been a naked attempt to uncover her source. Annika is also the author of a brand new book called On Secrets and published by Hachette, which is about the lasting impact of that heavy-handed police raid on her personally and her thoughts about the wider media landscape too. So first of all, Annika, it's a great honor to have you. Thank you very much.
Happy to be with you.
It's also Saturday evening there, and I know you're on deadline, so thanks for taking the time out. We'll appreciate it if you get a telephone call halfway through. A couple of quick housekeeping points. First of all, if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask them immediately, and then by the time we come to them, we have a list of good questions. But put those questions in the Q&A facility rather than the chat facility, so that we can see them. So my first question to Annika, before we get to the raid itself, perhaps you could tell us something about the surveillance story itself, because it sounds important.
Yeah, and it was something that I was a little bit, I guess, disappointed with it. When you write a story at the time, I'd hoped it'd get some incredible bounce and maybe be nominated for an award, I don't know, and be followed up. But it was such a difficult story for me to write. And once I knew what was happening, to source information, that I guess it was very hard for my colleagues to sort of bounce off without confirmation. And it was something the government were denying. So this is a story I wrote back in 2018. And it came about that in Australia, we have 6 spy agencies. Some spy on Aussies, some spy on foreigners, and they all sort of work together within their own special remits. And one of them, the ASD, now they're our cyber spies, our cyber spooks. They traditionally only look at foreign threats. In fact, their motto is to protect Australians against foreign threats. It's hard in cyberspace to distinguish that, but they usually say for computers within Australia, and we assume that's an Australian, so we don't hack those. There was a proposal being discussed by the heads of our defence departments and our Home Affairs department to expand that power and to actually turn that spy power on Australians. And it would be covert. It could be with a warrant signed off by a minister that could give our best spooks in the country, cyber spooks, access to text messages, water bills, banking, things that, and they'd be able to get in, I guess, without you even knowing they were ever there. So this was a huge change. And look, I don't take a position on whether we need it or not. The government have said that it's to catch pedophiles and other crooks, and it's not something that, you know, I can see the merit in that. But I guess one of the biggest concerns was that they weren't telling us about this. I found out about it. I wrote about it. They denied it. They've since now started that process of actually doing this. But I guess I just wanted to fast track the proposal and tell Australians before the government were willing to actually have that conversation. And I think when you go to make huge national security changes like that, it's vitally important to take the populace with you. And since September 11, Australia has had more than 60 law changes or amendments to national security laws, and that's more than any other Western civilization, any other Western country. And this is something that is alarming to a lot of Australians, and we all understand the safety. We've managed to not have many security issues here, thank God, and many terrorist attacks, but they just don't seem to be having that conversation about to justify the need for increased surveillance and security. And it was a story we thought was really important to tell.
And there was a whole year that story being published without the police being involved. Did the story just die a death, or was it a big story at the time?
Oh, look, I work for a Sunday paper, so it was on the front of all the Sunday papers across Australia. We have about 3 million readers, and to put that in perspective, we have a population of just over 20 million. So we have a lot of readers. But by the time Monday came around, it was hard for my colleagues to follow it up. They didn't have the access to, sources that I did. So it got a bit of a follow-up. Ministers were asked about it. They denied it. They announced that it would be, they might look at getting the police involved in where the leak came from. This happens a lot in Australia. If there's a sanctioned, document or piece of information that goes missing or is leaked, they say they bring the AFP in. Usually the AFP calls that journalist, the Australian Federal Police, and says, "Where'd you get it?" They say, "I'm not going to tell you." And we all move on with our lives. So look, I did know the police were going to take a look, but as you say, that was in April 2018, and it wasn't until June 2019 that I received a knock at the door. So I guess I just thought that everybody had forgotten about it and had gone away.
So maybe then you can take us through the raid on the 4th of June. I understand you were waiting for the carpet cleaner, so must have been very confused when the cavalry showed up.
I was. Look, to put this in context, we just had an election. We had an election in May 2019, I think. Yes, May. And as a journalist, especially in Australia, it's a big place. I spent a lot of time on the road. So they basically commissioned 2 aeroplanes, one to follow the Labor leader, one to follow the Prime Minister. And you join, one of those planes and you travel around for a month. Sometimes you go to 3-4 cities in a day. So I hadn't spent a lot of time at home, and I'd just come off this. I had some interstate media commitments, and I hadn't really spent much time in my house. So I went home one Tuesday morning about 9 o'clock. I'd flown in, and within 10 minutes, I received a knock at the door. And I'd actually, as they say, I'd come home to meet a carpet cleaner to fix a wine stain on the carpet. And I do have a peephole in my door, but I didn't look through it that morning because I thought I knew who would be on the other side. And it wasn't the carpet cleaner. It was 5 members of the Australian Federal Police. And once they knew I was home, they called for 2 more. And I put that in the context of I'm now convinced that they were following me because they knew I was going to be home that morning. And as I said, I hadn't been home for a while. It was rare for me to come home. I'd obviously been texting this carpet cleaner. So that was something I found really difficult, that this wasn't, a random sort of knock at the door, which on that morning, I think I thought it was. And in hindsight, it seems that I'd been under surveillance for a while myself.
Wow, did you follow that up, the idea that you were under surveillance? Is there any way to follow that up?
Look, there isn't. I've spoken to a few people within this community and they've all said, "Oh yeah, of course you were. Of course you were." Like, that's how they operate. And I guess there's nothing I can really do about that. It's something that it really alarms me, actually, that, they would have been listening to phone calls, and not for any reason that perhaps it was a source or anything I was talking to, but just those private phone calls you have with loved ones or friends and people that trust you with their information, whether it just be a girlfriend having a chat or my parents, or to think that their information was put at risk because somebody was following me. It sat really poorly with me for a long time.
Yeah. So to go back to the raid then, for 7 hours, apparently you watched as the police trawled through your bins, your fridge, your computer, even your underwear drawer, according to the more salacious coverage. You talk a little bit about the kind of standing around while that happened and your thoughts?
Yeah, it was incredible. You don't realise how much stuff you have in your house until people go through every bit one by one. And when I say every bit, they took jackets out of the cupboard and looked through the pockets, or handbags, and went through every pocket, and my bin. It was a year after I'd written the story, but they insisted on going through the food scraps in my bin, my freezer, opening containers, makeup drawers. They were basically looking for any sign, any evidence of documents, notes I'd made, phone numbers that might have been in my house. And it was incredible. Like, I didn't realize I was a control freak perhaps until put in that position, but I like, to have control of these situations, and I'm very much a type A personality. And I had to, once they had a warrant, I just had to sit back and watch this eventuate. And I went through a lot of different emotions. At some stages I wanted to control it and I'd sort of be laughing it off, and then I'd just be, almost hysterically crying. Because as this was happening, it was broadcast live on television. So at one stage we flicked the television on and the cameras were all live on my house. And I was getting calls from the New York Times, from book publishers, from my incredibly worried family. And it was just, It was surreal. It was, I don't know how I actually got through that day. I had two very good lawyers there who followed the police around and wrote down everything they did, because knowing that I wouldn't be able to remember it because of what was sort of happening, and wouldn't be able to have detail later on. So it was an incredibly good thing for them to do. And at times they'd chat to me, these police, and I don't actually hold anything against them personally. I don't feel anybody goes into the police force to raid a, youngish female journalist's home. I believe they go in to chase crooks, and it felt like they probably felt a little bit uncomfortable about it too. But some of them tried to make small talk and ask me as they were going through recipe books what my favorite recipe was, or which football team I support. And at times I'd have these conversations, and then I'd remember what they were there for, and that they were perhaps trying to butter me up, or perhaps see if I slipped up. And I'd pull myself back and say, don't talk to them, Annika. So it was a very strange day, and I managed to keep it together in front of everybody until everyone left, and then I was just hysterical. So it wasn't my finest hour.
No, I can imagine. Jeez. It's amazing how quickly book publishers are after Mark nowadays, isn't it?
They called before my parents, so.
Wow, that tells you a lot. Do you think, in retrospect, this was an act of intimidation, or it seemed like they thought they knew what they were looking for?
Look, I would question how long it took for them to come to my house. If it was, as they sort of said, that what I'd written was a risk to national security, then why didn't they rock up the Monday after it was published? If they were really after information, why didn't they rock up that quickly? The fact it took them more than a year suggests that perhaps it was more about trying to flush out information. There was the thought that after they'd come to my house and before, that my phone was bugged. So perhaps a raid on my house might trigger something. Maybe I'd start having conversations about it, or things like this. I don't believe I did, because I was well prepared for this by this stage. But I think it was an act of intimidation, and not just against journalists. I think most journalists are bolshy. I think, as much as I get asked, would I write the story again? The jury's still out on that. But in terms of, if a good story comes across the journalist's desk, they're not going to write it. Somebody will always write it. But I think to stop whistleblowers coming forward and people within the government that see something wrong, I think it definitely sent a message to them that we will come for you. And I think that's really the danger here.
That's really interesting, sort of chilling whistleblowers as well as sources. I mean, obviously you can't comment on your sources, but what do you think they might have been looking for, if anything? Can you say anything at all about that? Perhaps not, for obvious reasons.
Look, they also went through my phone, which I didn't touch on, and they did take text messages. So they went through my house and didn't find anything physical, but I assume they were looking for sort of notes I'd taken or phone numbers, perhaps. They didn't come across anything. But in terms of my phone, they took 140 text messages. And look, I'm a millennial. I have 10,000 photos on my phone, a lot of contacts, a lot of text. So they couldn't go through it all manually. So they used timestamps around the story, maybe 2 weeks either side. They also, I had identified some sort of people they thought I might have been in contact with within the government to find out about that. Then they used keywords. So the next day after the story had run, a friend sent me a text saying it was a great yarn, and a friend who's not a journalist, they took that text. So they were just after anything, really. It felt a bit like a phishing exercise. I was pretty comfortable that nothing they took was going to identify a source or sources or anyone I spoke to for this story, because I'm pretty wise in how I use my electronics. But I think in this day and age, you actually can't guarantee any 100% security with anybody unless you're using basically snail mail or, deep throat type situations where you talk in a car park, because there's always going to be some trace of people you've spoken to, contacts you have. And alarmingly, that could be the actual source or not the source at all. And other people who you might just know. Canberra's a small place. Everyone who lives in Canberra works in politics. And inadvertently, I think, I also felt terribly guilty that people who weren't my sources that could have got caught up in this.
Absolutely. Can you say anything about why it might have taken them a year to arrive at your door?
There's been a lot of theories on that too. It was just after an election win by the coalition government. They weren't expected to win. The Labor government were expected to win everybody got it wrong. It was an unexpected victory. And within a few weeks, they appeared at my house, and they were in power when I'd written the story. So there was a lot of speculation around that. I really don't know. I'm not the sort of person to just have a theory and run with it. I'd prefer some sort of evidence on that. But the following day after they raided my house, they raided the ABC, our national broadcaster in Sydney. They were chasing a different story, but two colleagues of mine who I know, Sam and Dan, had written a story from some leaked documents for defence. They'd written the story before I'd written my original story. And they went in there to try and find something about that. Now that case is ongoing. So it did seem to be strange that they did my house on the Tuesday, the ABC offices on the Wednesday, and I am told there was a third raid planned for the Sydney headquarters of my building, where my editors work, on the Thursday, but it didn't end up going ahead. And I don't know why. There's some thought that perhaps they were worried about their warrant, or maybe, you know, the pressure of 2 days worth of raids making international headlines was too much for them to go ahead.
So in April, the Australian High Court ruled that warrant invalid, and then the following month, the police announced that you wouldn't be charged over stories which relied on classified intelligence documents. Is that the end of the matter? Because the police still retain material, don't they?
It was interesting. So we decided to challenge the warrant in the High Court. The ABC challenged it in the Federal Court, and they lost. Last November, we went to the High Court of Australia and said that the warrant was invalid. And look, it wasn't on any, unfortunately, any grand press freedom grounds. It was sloppiness, really, that the warrant hadn't been filled out correctly. And this often happens. They get them signed off by a lower level magistrate, and the police hadn't taken as much care as they had perhaps hoped. And we went to the full bench of the High Court. I'd never been to court before in my life, and the first time was the full 7 justices of the High Court of Australia, something I wish never to have happen again. So we got that result of about 6 months later, as you say, in April, and it was a really interesting ruling. And look, I'm no legal expert. I've become a bit better at it over the past 12 months, but we won on the grounds that the warrant wasn't right. So coming into my house was trespass, and that's what the court ruled, but they let them keep what they take. And the way it was explained to me is that if they had have come into my house and taken my couch or my television, they would have had to return it. But because they took a copy of electronic data, their claim was that they actually hadn't denied me of anything. I wasn't without my couch or my television. They had made a copy of 145 text messages and removed them. They didn't have to, even though they obtained those illegally through trespass, the court said they didn't have to destroy them. And a lot of people congratulated me for this High Court win in April, and I actually felt numb and incredibly sick that up until then they hadn't been able to look at those documents and that digital data. But once the court case was over, they were granted access. So we had this win on paper in the High Court, but not just for me, but for any journalist coming through, to think that the police could illegally obtain your information and then potentially use it to charge you. It didn't feel like much of a win at all. But as you say, about 7 or 8 weeks later, they managed to look through that and decide there wasn't enough evidence there to go after me. And I found this out. I hope no police are listening. I was in my car and I saw something flash up on my screen of my computer, of my phone, and it said it was from the AFP. And I thought, that's strange. So it was, I did eventually pull over and read it. And it was a letter that just said, you know, we're not got enough evidence to go after you. But I didn't at all feel vindicated at that point until I wanted to know that they were destroying the data at that point, and also that they weren't going to go after a whistleblower, because if they had have said they're not going to go after me, but they were going to try and find out my source, I wouldn't have felt any victory at all. And I would have felt, you know, just as stuck as I have felt for the last 2 years of my life.
So the police now say that they've destroyed that material and it won't be used in future investigations. Sounds a bit odd. I mean, and not much of a disincentive for them to have done it in the first place. But anyway, what do you make of that?
I'm not too sure. Look, they did have to, initially they took a whole swipe of my whole phone. They took all the information and kept it. And we asked for a stat deck to say that that had been destroyed, which we eventually got. but I've been a journalist for a long time. Perhaps I'm a little cynical, and I'd like to think they didn't hold any of that data, but you know, who knows?
Well, I've got lots more questions, but just so I don't monopolize the conversation, Annika, there's some great questions that have come in from the audience. So let's run through a couple of those. Penny has written, have you modified the way that you keep notes and contact telephone numbers since the raid?
Yes, and look, I should have, every journalist says you should do it earlier, and I was pretty good. I'm not new to this, and I'm not silly, but even I sort of looked at some of my things I had on my phone, and I realised how sloppy I was being. But you don't ever think it's going to happen to you, and you don't want to also be too paranoid. So one thing, it made me burn a lot of letters like family members had sent me, which is absurd, but I was so upset that the police might come back again. I burnt birthday cards and things my grandmother had sent me, which I now regret, but I was just so disappointed, I guess, that those were no longer secret. In terms of journalism, I've always known it's the golden rule. If you're going to have a conversation, have it over the phone, don't text it. I would say I abide by that 90% of the time now, as opposed to perhaps 50% of the time. I don't put things in email very often. I use Signal and other sort of encrypted services. I can't guarantee they're all, I guess, 100% useful, but I do know from the raid on my house that some things were inaccessible, at least through a traditional warrant. I don't know what backroom things go on through different organisations, but my understanding was they weren't able to access it, or at least if they were, they wouldn't be able to use that in court. So there does still remain, I guess, ways around it. But my sort of the alarming realisation I had is that we can't 100% guarantee to our sources anymore that they will be safe. We can do everything in our power to do it. You can use Signal, you can have secret meetings, but if you have an iPhone on you, being able to track where you go, there's talk that there is sort of some sort of surveillance that says it can record you even when it's off. So short of leaving it home, walking, not getting Ubers, all these things just monitor us. And it's increasingly difficult to guarantee to anybody that you just, you can protect them.
And sometimes by the time people have got in touch with you, they might have already compromised themselves.
Absolutely. Okay. And I think that's the one thing you have to learn too, that you can't take, and I did hold a lot of guilt for people that had talked to me for this story, but if people are reaching out to you, they do have to understand their responsibility too. And we can do everything we can in our power, but at the same time, they've made a decision as a consenting adult, and you have to accept that.
And someone called Lennart has written, do you have any indication that chilling effect on as a result of the raid worked? Did you find people more reluctant to talk to you afterwards, or more keen to talk to you because of the publicity?
Look, both ways. It's a really interesting story. I've spoken to some other sort of senior investigative journalists in Australia, and they said they noticed actual effect of this, that people weren't as willing to talk, and perhaps they might bring up my name and say, oh, but what about the Smethurst case or the AFP case? So it was definitely something that scared a lot of people, which is disappointing. For me personally, 100%, I found it incredibly difficult. I work in Parliament House. I've been a political reporter for 10 years. I have the phone numbers of every politician that's passed through this place, and I found it very difficult to earn that trust again. And it wasn't that they didn't trust me, but all of a sudden they knew that things they had texted me and conversations they were having with me might be monitored. And it has taken a long time to start to build that trust up again. Look, in some ways it did a lot for my profile. I'm a very well-known journalist in Australia through this now. That hasn't always resulted necessarily in people wanting to talk to me. I'm recognised and people could probably all name me, but it didn't, it almost was, I was a victim of the success of the story, in that I think it has prevented me getting a lot of yarns in the last year.
Gosh, that is chilling. Someone else has written, do you know who tipped off the TV station outside your house? Would that have been on the police side or the journalist side?
I don't know. I told my workplace, obviously, but I told them not to send anybody else. They sent someone from our organisation. I'm still a bit unsure about that. And I feel a bit weird as a journalist being derogatory or being upset that perhaps somebody came to my house. It's something I've done many a time, sat on the, front lawn of other people's houses. So I guess if you can give it, you've got to suck it up. But it was one thing that I did learn through this, is being on the other side of the lens. I've done that, and I've chased people and thrown questions at them and people in the spotlight. And I guess hopefully being on the other side will make me a better journalist in the future, to understand, I guess, as journalists, we interview people through unexpected, wild, wonderful, and terribly sad moments. And sometimes that could be an amazing reason, like you've won a gold medal. Sometimes it's through absolute tragedy. And most of the time, people don't want to be thrown into the spotlight when they do end up in the spotlight. And I guess having a little bit of a sense of the issues that you go through and the sympathy, I hope it's something that I understand in the future, because it wasn't just me, it was my parents and a lot of other people that sort of got dragged into this. So yeah, it's not something I ever want to go through again, but if I'm going to take something good out of it, it's that I can learn what it's like to be on the other side.
Yeah, well, that's a neat sort of way into talking about the trust deficit, which is something you've, I think, talked about before, and the idea that sometimes the public don't trust us, and they need to understand better what most investigative journalists do so they can support us when things go wrong. Any suggestions for how we might better prevent or help the public understand what we do?
Look, it's a terribly huge question, isn't it? And I think as a profession, we've probably not been good at explaining what we do. Obviously, journalists get a bad rap, and sometimes that's for a good reason. But I think we often get judged by the worst of our profession, and we don't celebrate the victories. And it's something I've sort of noticed on social media, which is a terrible place, but when a story comes out and is published, you hear people say, why is the mainstream media avoiding this? Or I read this online. And there's no understanding that behind that tweet where you saw it, or the post on Facebook, was a journalist who got a tip, who made the calls, who did the hard yards, who did the work. Now, there's a lot of movies and in popular culture stories about journalists doing this, but I think there is a failure to understand, I guess, the grit and the backroom that goes into producing a story. That's probably a little bit of our own fault that we've done that. I also think, through the 24-hour news cycle, through financial constraints on our industry, perhaps we haven't been the best journalists we could be in recent years, and we haven't produced the best product. And it's very hard to encourage people to fight for something when, you're not sort of producing the best quality stuff. And that's really cyclical, because as constraints get stronger and COVID and advertising revenue dries up, and it's going to be increasingly hard to invest in good journalism. And then, unless we can invest in good journalism, I don't know how we mount a case for people to trust us to deliver the news.
Absolutely. So Caitlin Hart has written, you probably can't answer some of this question, but she is interested in how you stored the information gathered for that particular story, as opposed to how you communicated. I mean, I'm guessing you don't want to say too much about that, but any general thoughts about storage of information or documents in ways that might be helpful?
It's funny, I have so much I'd love to say, but there's so much I can't. But I did write about this in my book, and I actually asked some of my colleagues what they do when they get information. And back in my early career, I remember I had a government document I perhaps shouldn't have had. And my editor told me to carry it around in my handbag and never leave it in the one place. And I think I'd forgotten about it months later and found it at the bottom there. I spoke to one colleague that told me he'd got a cabinet brief that he wasn't meant to have, and he dug a hole in his parents' backyard without telling them and left it there. So, look, I do know, I won't talk about this direct story, but with other stories, I've done that. Holding on to it for the least amount of time if you do get documents, and often, you don't get documents, it's verbal, but I think tends to be the key. You don't want to have this for long enough that somebody knows what you're about to publish, and then, we usually, I don't know how it works everywhere where everyone's listening from, but we would usually go to a source the day before publishing for that very reason. We wouldn't sort of go to them a week before and say, we're going to publish this in a couple of weeks, because it leaves the door open for a raid or something like that. So I think holding on to things for the minimal amount of time had I have known what I know now, I have an office at Parliament House, and many people have asked why police didn't actually raid my office, why they came to my personal home. But to get into Parliament and to raid an office at Parliament House, one, would have been very controversial, but two, they would have had to have approval from the Speaker and the President of both chambers of Parliament, and that would have almost seen them as sanctioning it. So I hadn't realised that perhaps keeping things at Parliament House would have been a far safer thing to do. But look, it has been put to me too, giving, why don't you give documents to loved ones that aren't involved in the game, whether that be friends or family members. And I know many people that have given that sort of stuff to, their parents, but I would be hesitant to get anybody else in trouble. And as I say, if there's any sort of communication that you've been to a certain location, or if you've, travelled there or seen someone recently or text them and caught up and said, thanks for the meal the other night or whatever, it then, can get a lot of other people in trouble. So I think, for me, I'm the only one I want to put at risk.
But old school methods. I like the idea of digging things around in the back garden.
I do too. It's kind of like that, in All the President's Men, where you put a pot plant on the balcony when you want to have a conversation or something like that. Like, it's a really lovely way to think that it works, but we're all busy people, and I don't know who has time, what sort of journalists have time to sort of put a red flag in their window and wait for a source to get in touch. So I think through time constraints, often, electronic communication is the easiest way, but it's the one that can get us in the most trouble.
Absolutely, absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about secrets and the book, which presumably led you to experience or to reflect on the nature of modern government and how secretive governments can be, even when they're evangelizing about freedom of information and transparency. So any larger thoughts that emerged from this about how government works, because government works in sort of cumbersome, inefficient ways, and with regard to all these things, I wonder just your reflection on that.
Yeah, look, one thing I guess I discovered through my own experiences is that I'm not somebody that just thinks information should be made public because we're the voters and we should access all the information. I do understand why some things are classified. That could be because it puts someone at risk, or a court case involving children. And I'm not sort of so out there in my views on free press that I think it should just be dumped online for everybody to see. Having said that, I think the government uses that as, particularly here, as a way to keep information classified that really doesn't need to be. And I was chatting to some government ministers, cabinet ministers, during this process the last year, writing my book, and one of them suggested to me that some of the stuff that comes across his desk is, got the similar importance to a shopping list, and yet it's got classified on it. That is done for one reason, to keep it from the public. And I think we are calling for changes in Australia. All the media organisations have come together to call for a number of changes, and one of them is a review of that system. The other thing is they often say, they wheel a bunch of documents through cabinet and sprinkle them with cabinet dust. And the moment you do that, it means that any leak has to be investigated. So I think we do need to have a look at things that may appear transparent but aren't. Our FOI system is a joke in this country. It is one run on state bounds. There's also a federal system, and they're different in every state. There is a string of reasons why you can't access documents. They can, give you documents, and this happens very regularly, where the whole page is blanked out except for about 2 lines, and you've had to pay good money for it. So there needs to definitely be an overhaul of that. And also, we are one of the only countries where the national security agencies are actually not even in the FOI Act. So it doesn't matter how many years after or what information, you could be requesting how many paper clips at, ASIO or the Australian Federal Police, and the information is classified and cannot be released. And I just think, if we're getting to that level, it's just absurd. It doesn't work in the interest of Australians. If they're going to be asking for increasing trust from us to implement stricter national security laws, which could be justifiable, but if they want that trust from the Australian people, we need to have something back. And I think that's access to information and what they're doing in our name.
Penny has written a question about the story, and I had a question of my own about that. Did your story actually delay or modify any of those planned surveillance changes? And then I wonder about, was there any kind of backlash as a result of the raid? Did that help with the story in terms of getting it out there?
I believe it did delay it. At the time, it was being discussed by the head of defence and the head of home affairs. And to my knowledge, it wasn't made public to the Prime Minister at the time. That was Malcolm Turnbull. And I'm told that once he found out about it, he wasn't impressed with it. And some other sort of senior ranking ministers weren't, and they stopped it. In the year that followed, he was rolled as Prime Minister. We have a rotating door of Prime Ministers in Australia, as you no doubt are aware. So we got another Prime Minister later in the year who might be a little bit more, I guess, willing to pursue such a policy. It was almost a year after, it was at the start of this year, that they sort of, the language started to change around it, and questions started to be asked again. And all of a sudden, head of departments and head of national security agencies are starting to mount an argument for these changes. So the story was right. It's been confirmed as right, despite for a year the head of a certain department and some ministers going on the record to public committees, Hansard, newspapers, saying that I was wrong and a terrible reporter. It was proven right. I think my story did slow it down. And as I say, I'm not taking a moral stance on the story. I just wanted to get the information out there. It would have had to come out eventually because it would have had to pass Parliament, and it still would have to pass Parliament in order for it to happen. I guess the government just wanted to do it on their terms when they thought the time was right, and I just fast-tracked that for them.
And so, given that you were surveilled and raided yourself, would that not sort of add to sort of the public understanding of the issues?
It did seem like a great irony that I was writing about surveillance issues and then myself, went through this. When we talk about the public, look, I think the gist I got, and I got thousands of emails and some wonderful support, and not too many people saying, I deserve to be locked up, although I did get a few. Look, I think getting the public revved up about press freedom is quite difficult. It's hard enough to get journalists revved up about it. So I don't think there's sort of this overwhelming, people going to take to the streets in a sort of climate change, Black Lives Matter manner to get out there and, protest for freedom of the press. Having said that, I don't think the general public like their information being, exposed and available to security agencies. I still think we're private people, and we do have a certain threshold when it comes to things we want the government to know. And we all understand we have to give up some rights in order to protect the greater good. But I do think there's a balance there, and that the Australian people weren't comfortable with A, the change that was being proposed, and B, what happened to me. I think, they could see that sending 7 police around to my house for 7 hours and to the offices of the ABC was a stupid use of resources. It was clogged up in the courts for a year, and that I wasn't I shouldn't have been targeted. And they might not necessarily like my reporting or my newspaper, and they might not go out in the street and march for press freedom. But the gist I got through the feedback in my inbox and anecdotally was that people thought it was wrong.
Gotcha. So the idea of personal rights versus the public good is sort of topical now because of COVID. And given that we have you temporarily, it would be wrong not to ask you about COVID in Australia and everything that's happening there, given that we have very little understanding of what's happening in Australia. And there's been a second lockdown in 1 or 2 cities. Maybe you could say something about that for us while you're here.
Absolutely. We actually got out of it quite well when you look at examples in Europe or the US of what's happening. The death rate has been particularly low here. I think about 100 people have died, which is a tragedy, but compared to overseas, we've managed to keep those figures quite low. Obviously, we're lucky we're an island country, and we closed the border to China and also to other countries very early on. Since late March, anyone that's returned to Australia has had to spend 2 weeks in a hotel that's paid for by the government. They're guarded, and that's seen 70,000 people return, and that's managed to keep the cases quite low. About a month ago, we went almost COVID-free, it looked like. And then, yes, as you say, down in Victoria, in the state of Victoria and Melbourne, there was an issue with security guards. The Victorian government, as opposed to the New South Wales government and other governments, had hired private security contractors to man these hotels. And there was no police or army, as they were in other states, working with security guards. And it turns out they were letting people out during the 2 weeks. They were sharing cigarette lighters. There's allegations that some of the security guards slept with some of the people staying at the hotels. No. And this has led to a second wave in Victoria, which is rising dramatically. At the moment, the borders are shut, which in Australia is unheard of. It hasn't happened since the Spanish flu. So the rest of the country is enjoying, really eased restrictions, except in Victoria. There is an issue, there is concern that it's already spread actually, and that perhaps we're only 2 weeks away from being locked up again, like those poor people in my home state of Victoria. But at the moment, it's incredible, and a lot has been written about ministerial responsibility and government responsibility, because this is a direct result about a decision the government took or didn't take, and it'll be interesting to see how that state government goes, because there's a lot of anger down there in Victoria. A lot of lives could be lost, businesses, and it's a real tragedy.
Absolutely. It also sounds like a good story about the Australian private security industry.
I think there definitely is another story there. It's rather incredible. Anyway.
Listen, thank you so much for your time, Annika. We are extremely grateful to have you. We know you're taking time out, so thanks so much. Maybe next time we can have you in the flesh. Thanks to everyone else for turning up too. So good luck with the book On Secrets by Hachette, which is a great publisher, and keep doing what you're doing. Annika Smethurt, thank you very much.
I really appreciate being part of it, and great event.
Keep in touch. Cheers.